We'll continue here this evening with Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, three kings of the southern kingdom. Continuing through the divided monarchy period, although technically there is only one kingdom left because the northern kingdom has been demolished, although that takes place during the early part of the reign of Hezekiah. So in a way, we're actually just continuing on the other side of the history. This evening, we're going to continue looking at obscure passages in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and then we're going to give a summary of the book of Isaiah and the book of Micah as well, because those two prophets are contemporary with all the events that we're talking about here tonight. And then looking forward in our calendar, we have 4 weeks in a row, and then we have a break for Easter Sunday. So we will look at the rest of the kingdom of Judah and the period of exile in Babylon over the next 3 weeks. And tonight, after Easter, we'll be looking at the post-exile period, starting with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And it won't be long, and we will actually be finishing this up. Graduation day is on Sunday, the 18th of May. We don't have class the week before on Mother's Day, because that's a holiday we will not violate. So we are getting close to the end of the Old Testament survey. But let's go ahead and jump into Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. What?
I spelled Hezekiah correctly.
All right, so these are three kings of the line of David. And so that means that the southern kingdom and the capital city remains Jerusalem. That did not change through the entirety of the kingdom. Jotham gets to reign for 16 years. He is only 25 years old when he becomes king, so somehow he dies at the age of 41, which is strangely young when you're 43. So then the next two are Ahaz and Hezekiah. Ahaz reigning 16 years. He was king at 20 years old. Interesting thing about Ahaz is that he was only 10 or 11 years old when Hezekiah was born. So that's one of those eyebrow-raising genealogy things. Ahaz was 11 when Hezekiah was born.
Who was Hezekiah's mommy?
I'm sorry, what?
Who was Hezekiah's mom?
I don't know if she's named. Micaiah, you want to look into that and see if Hezekiah's got a mother? So.
Does that even work? Does it even work at 11?
It does. There's a few documented cases of it.
And this is one of them.
This is one of them.
Well, it depends. Some boys mature faster, I guess.
Yes.
And then
For the sake of Ahaz, I hope they got that wrong.
Can you imagine having a kid at the age of 11?
Mm-hmm.
Like not giving birth to one but fathering one?
The mom was probably, his mom's probably older than his dad.
Oh, I don't like that. But not necessarily.
Yep, yeah, because the way it works out, since Ahaz reigns for 16 years and he was 20 years old when he became king, but Hezekiah was 25. Ahaz is only 36 years old when he dies and Hezekiah takes the throne. So you take that 36 and subtract 25, and Ahaz is 11 years old when when Hezekiah is born. So Jotham found him a wife at a very young age. It's an interesting thing because there's an alternative way of rendering the history, and that little detail was forgotten, and so the alternative rendering of that history actually has Hezekiah being born to Ahaz 6 or 7 years before Ahaz is born, which is another one of those things where you can't condense the years.
Will we be quizzed on that?
Nope, that is not a part of the quiz. That was just a bonus tidbit. Alright, so moving along to the reign of Jotham. Jotham was a righteous king. Remember, his father Uzziah was arrogant and proud and entered the temple trying to offer incense in the role the priests were only supposed to do. He does not do that. He learned from his father's ways. However, while Jotham was king, the high places were not removed, and the people of Judah did not follow God wholeheartedly like Jotham did. And so you start seeing the kingdom of Judah is shifting away from the ways of God and starting to worship idols and false worship fashions.
The mother of Hezekiah's name.
Yeah, so what's the name of Hezekiah's mother?
Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. Abi.
Abi. Alright. Uh-huh.
How old was she?
Yeah, that's not never listed.
They never list that.
Older than Ahaz was.
Hopefully.
Almost guaranteed.
Oh, I reckon it was
She probably had to be in order to have a
It
kid.
was probably a political marriage.
It
Oh, yeah.
probably was a political marriage. Who knows who her father was that it was important to align with, but
Zechariah.
yes, I know. Zechariah, who knows who he was though, like
There was multiple Zacharias,
Yeah.
just like there are today.
Zechariah the 16th. Yeah. Anyway, Jotham subjugates the Ammonites, much like David had done. But during Jotham's reign, Judah starts getting pressured by Rezin the king of Aram, the Arameans, and Pekah the king of Israel. I think it's Pekah the son of Remaliah. And there's actually quite a few prophecies in Isaiah about him. So this is where Judah starts benefiting from all of the counter siege works and towers that Uzziah built in his generation. It's kind of fascinating how what Uzziah builds, Judah is able to benefit from through the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and especially Hezekiah when Jerusalem is under siege fully. Now Jotham doesn't have a whole lot of things of note in his reign, but the political winds in the area are definitely moving against Judah, and the people are starting to stray away from God. His son, Ahaz, ends up being the most wicked king of Judah to date.
Oh my, that's quite a title.
Yes, that is. Now, that doesn't mean that he almost matches Ahab. He's a very wicked king, but this is Judah we're speaking of, not Israel. Of the northern kings, there wasn't a single righteous one. The southern kingdom, up to this point, had generally had righteous kings, except for a few short-lived unrighteous ones, and some that were kind of just a 50-50 gray zone. This guy was just flat-out wicked. So he walks in the ways of the kings of Israel, introduces Baal worship. He practices child sacrifice in the valley of Ben Hinnom. Yep, exactly. Yes.
Huh?
Yeah.
His kid?
His
His
kids.
son.
Yep. Hezekiah was a survivor. And then he burns incense at the high places, the hilltops, and under all the spreading trees. And during this time, Judah just gets ground into powder. They lose battles to both Israel and the Arameans. So this is one of those battles here. Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, comes, and 120,000 soldiers of Judah die in the battle. 200,000 captives are taken to Samaria with plunder. Don't know if all the captives were soldiers or if there was soldiers and their wives and children. It's hard to say. So that might have been part of the army, might not have been. An obscure prophet by the name of Oded prophesies, and the northern kingdom returns all the captives without charging what's the word I'm looking for? Ransom. That's what they would normally do, is ransom them or sell them into slavery. Oded prophesies and says, the wrath of God will be falling on us shortly. We don't need to add to our wickedness. But Ahaz starts losing like in every single direction. The Edomites attack Judah and he loses. The Philistines attack Judah and he loses. And Ahaz does not turn to God for help. Instead, he turns to Tiglath-Pileser of the Assyrians. This is the same Tiglath-Pileser that was on the quiz earlier. So he empties out the treasury of the palace and the temple, sends all that gold and silver to Tiglath-Pileser in Assyria, and the Assyrians come from the far north and destroy the kingdom of Aram, and the Arameans are no more. All the Arameans get deported out of Damascus and the surrounding areas and sent to other parts of the Assyrian Empire because that was their policy of pacification. At the same time, they don't stop just with the Arameans. Tiglath-Pileser continues down on the east side of the Jordan River and takes out all of the eastern tribes from Israel. That would be Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. So Israel is significantly reduced in its size at this point in time. So then Ahaz meets the victorious Tiglath-Pileser in Damascus, and he sees the temple to the god of the Arameans in Damascus, who just lost, and he draws a version of the altar there, and he's like, this is a really cool altar, so we're going to send the drawings of these back to Jerusalem so we can start worshiping the Aramean god in Jerusalem, because obviously that's a great idea. So he returns to Jerusalem, starts offering sacrifices on the new altar, and he starts remodeling the temple that Solomon built so that it is more suitable for worshiping the pagan gods that all just got defeated by Tiglath-Pileser. Not the brightest bulb in the world. Strangely enough, after 16 years of wickedness reigning on the throne, Ahaz dies at the age of 36, and his son Hezekiah takes the throne, and Hezekiah is the most righteous king of Judah since David. Yep, so we have this amazing turnaround, and Hezekiah starts it on the first day of the first month of the first year of his reign. He reverts back to the ways of his forefathers in a very, very significant move. So he removes all the high places, he smashes all the sacred stones, he cuts down the Asherah poles, and then remember the bronze snake that Moses set up in the wilderness? The Israelites were still worshiping that, and were not still worshiping, they started worshiping the bronze snake, and so Hezekiah nicknamed it the vile thing, Nehushtan, and then broke it up, and people no longer worship the bronze snake. Then he begins repairing and purifying the temple. And that took so long that they actually couldn't celebrate the Passover on time. And so it was an awful lot of work. But he does eventually get to it. There was a provision in the law of Moses that if you weren't ceremonially clean to celebrate the Passover in the first month, then you could be allowed to celebrate it in the second month.
That's Valentine's Day.
The 14th day of the second month, this would actually be in May, because it's a different calendar. But you're right. In our calendar, it would be February 14th. So, not enough priests were consecrated, so they pushed the whole national celebration back a month. When he does this, though, he ends up inviting Ephraim and Manasseh to come down and celebrate the Passover with them. And this is just before the Assyrians come and lay siege to Samaria. And so right before the final judgment of the northern kingdom, they have an opportunity to turn back to the Lord and worship him in Jerusalem the way they were supposed to, instead of worshiping the calf gods at Dan and Bethel. And a lot of them do. And it's such an amazing celebration of the Passover that they decide we're going to tack on an extra 7 days. And so they celebrated the Passover for 14 days instead of just 7.
I wonder if that prevented people from Ephraim and Manasseh from getting destroyed then.
There was a remnant that survived that siege and joined Judah down south. But that comes across here in a bit, or next week. Yeah. Some of them had an opportunity. There's always a path of life, even when a judgment is coming. So then, Hezekiah is attacked by Sennacherib, the next king of the Assyrian Empire. And this happens between 713 and 711 BC. And he lays siege to all the fortified cities of Judah and systematically wipes out every single one of them. Most famously, the city of Lachish, which was the second strongest city of Judah. And that is actually depicted on these famous stela here. And so Sennacherib had this all inscribed in stone. And it's fascinating because he shows the siege of Lachish, but he doesn't have anything about what happened around Jerusalem. And these are all found in Nineveh. And they're either part of the British Museum or some other museum today.
So what's being depicted there?
That is the army laying siege to Lachish. And this is Lachish getting destroyed and so forth. So that's something you can look up on the internet and find out more about. But this is a historical event that is recorded by the Assyrians and is laid out very similarly in the Bible as what the Assyrians report. And one of the things that's interesting about the Bible is that it notes all of all the defeats that the people of Israel suffer, and that's not normal in ancient history, because Sennacherib goes to Jerusalem and gets defeated there, and that's not recorded in any of his annals. But
They paused after
there you go. Yep. Anyway, so Sennacherib lays siege to Jerusalem, and there's a bit of a story here. Hezekiah ends up diverting the water from one of the springs outside the city walls, and he diverts it inside the city walls. And then Sennacherib sends the Rabshakeh, who is an official, with a threatening letter. And they read that letter out loud in the Hebrew tongue so that all the commoners on the wall would be able to hear, even though the diplomatic language of the day was Aramaic. And Hezekiah's men would have preferred that they were speaking in Aramaic so that all the commoners wouldn't have to listen to all the threats. But after a little bit of back and forth, the angel of the Lord comes and destroys 185,000 soldiers in the camp of the Assyrians, and Sennacherib just leaves without defeating Jerusalem. But this is the point where the Rabshakeh says, we'll give you 2,000 horses if you can find enough men to ride on them. And so you can see Jerusalem was reduced pretty badly at this point in time. One of the other interesting things, though, you can dig up archaeologically, is this actually is the diverted water channel that Hezekiah had dug through in an emergency. And they chiseled through solid stone to divert that water inside the city of Jerusalem. And you can go visit it today if you wanted to, and it's still there.
So they were under siege, but they got water to the city.
Yep, they were under siege, and the springs were outside the city, and Hezekiah didn't want the enemy army to be able to find plenty of water. And so he's like, we'll stop up the spring, but then we'll divert the water into the city so we have water and they don't.
Is that what it was talking about in the passage, and mentioning that it was in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think it was the Gihon spring or something like that. Yeah. But anyway, you can find that, and it is well attested that Hezekiah did it, and it's still there, cut through in stone. So around the same time, Hezekiah ends up getting sick. Isaiah the prophet comes to him and tells him he's going to die. Hezekiah cries out to the Lord, and Isaiah returns to him before even fully leaving the palace and says that he's going to live for 15 more years, and he gives him a sign, and this is when the sun's shadow goes back 15 steps.
It was
10 steps?
10. I read it today.
Okay. 10 steps backwards for 15 years more life. You have a question?
No.
No, you have a thought. All right.
Oh. Huh?
So how does a shadow go backwards, Ryan?
What? I'm so confused.
Shadows only go one direction in the course of a day normally, right? So Isaiah gives Hezekiah a sign and says, do you want the shadow to go forward on the steps or backwards on the steps? And Hezekiah says it's an easy thing for it to go forwards. That's what it always does, have it go backwards. So it goes backwards 10 steps, which means that the whole earth stopped moving in its revolution around its axis, or rotation on its axis, and then went backwards for a short bit, and then restarted its motion forwards. This is one of the greatest miracles of the entire Old Testament, in my opinion, short of the creation and such. God stopped the planet, rotated it backwards a little ways, and then restarted it to show Hezekiah's sign, you are going to get better from your disease.
So the impressive thing about that is if you stop the earth, all of the oceans would spill over into the continents in a tidal tsunamic wave that would literally level everything on all of the continents except for maybe like the steppes of Mongolia.
Yeah, so either inertia was put on hold for a little while, or God really slowly wound down the earth and then went backwards and then wound it down to a stop. It's hard to say how he did it precisely, but the magnitude of the miracle is kind of beyond fathoming, because right now we're traveling 700 mile an hour that direction. And if the earth came to a sudden stop, we would all hit the wall there at 700 mile an hour.
Do you
Ow!
think that all shadows were moving?
Hmm?
So every shadow was moving?
Well, the shadows move based on the way the earth rotates on its axis relative to the sun.
So the miracle wasn't one shadow, it was like
Wasn't
every
one shadow, would have been all
Oh,
shadows, yeah.
That's why Babylon's are noticed.
Yep, so the Babylonians seemed to notice this because they were the astronomers of their day. That was their strength, and they were always watching what was going on. They apparently inquired of what happened, who knows anything about this, and word got out that Hezekiah was given a sign he was going to get better, and so the Babylonians send envoys. This is where Hezekiah gets proud, which he shouldn't have been after having just barely survived the siege of the Assyrians and barely survived an illness, but he did. And so the prophet Isaiah says, everything you showed the Babylonians, they're going to carry off to Babylon.
And it was it.
And it was everything. So moving along, let's look at the prophets. Isaiah is the longest prophetic book in the Bible. It's actually the second longest Old Testament book entirely. Only the Psalms is longer. So it is longer than Genesis, longer than Jeremiah, and all the other big ones. He actually starts prophesying just at the very end of the reign of Uzziah, all through the reign of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, which gives him about a 65-year prophetic service to the kingdom. And he dies very early in Manasseh's reign. That's Hezekiah's son. And the thought is there's a reference in the New Testament to the men of faith who were stoned, sawn in two, and killed by the sword. And according to extra-biblical sources, Isaiah died by getting cut in half.
Oh.
He went running, hiding away from Manasseh, and he hid in a hollow tree, and Manasseh ordered him to come out of the tree, and he refused to come out of the tree, and so Manasseh said, cut it down. And so they sawed the tree down with Isaiah in the middle of it.
Why was he running away from Manasseh?
Manasseh ends up being the next most wicked king of all time.
How do you hide in the middle of a tree? It's not very intelligent.
Hollow tree. Hollow tree.
What source do we know this from?
I actually don't know which one they got that out of.
That's an
Would it be the
awful way to
Greek?
die.
Would it be the Greek source?
I just
No, wouldn't have been a Greek source. There's something known as the Old Testament Apocrypha.
Oh.
Sometimes that stuff has it. It could be that
No.
there's a few other sources that came out of that era.
Yeah.
Because the rabbis in Jesus' day like to fill in all the gaps from the Old Testament.
Right,
And
so they kind of let some
Yep.
stuff.
but this one got referenced in Hebrews, and so it is probably an accurate rendition, but it
Someone
doesn't
did.
specify who got cut in two, just that some of them did. And Isaiah was likely that one. So the book of Isaiah is 66 chapters long, and ironically it models the Bible itself, because the first 39 chapters have one distinct version to it, and there are 39 books in the Old Testament, and then the next 27 chapters have a very different theme, and there are 27 chapters in the New Testament. And it just so happens that if you were going to summarize the first 39 chapters, it's judgment and destruction.
You mean 35?
Nope, 39, because Hezekiah's reign is when Sennacherib is attacking, and
Oh.
he gets arrogant and proud, and so it's judgment and destruction, just all through. There's a remnant that's preserved, and then, yeah, from chapter 40 on is just a whole different line of thinking.
That's probably why people most often quote the later chapters.
Oftentimes, yes, but some of the coolest messianic prophecies are in the first 11 chapters, so.
So is Hezekiah's reign symbolic of the Gospels?
Nope, no, that would be the last 4 books of the minor prophets.
Oh.
It's not really symbolic of anything. It's just an interesting
Mm.
parallel that Isaiah's broken up much the same as the Bible
Right,
is.
yeah.
And it has similar themes in the breakdown too.
How many books are in the Old Testament?
39.
Oh.
Yep.
Wait, how many?
Oh, that makes sense then.
So, themes in the book of Isaiah: judgment and justice. Isaiah warns Israel to the north and Judah in the south, but also many of the surrounding nations about the divine judgment that was due to them because of their sin, their injustices, all their idolatry and unfaithfulness. And one of the other themes that comes out in Isaiah quite a bit is the idea of social justice. God was always looking out for the poor, the widows, and the orphans, and they were easy to mistreat because nobody was defending them, and that was something that God called out through the prophet Isaiah, is you're mistreating the poor, the widows, and the orphans. Also talks about the holiness of God. In fact, one of the most repeated titles for God in the book of Isaiah is the Holy One of Israel, used over 25 times. And we actually see in the vision of Isaiah in chapter 6, God in his throne room in the temple, and you see how he is very majestic, pure, and absolutely holy in that vision. And that is the standard by which the world is judged, which then we always end up finding ourselves wanting because we are not holy like God is. One of the other themes that comes out in Isaiah is the remnant. There's always going to be a judgment coming, but God always promises to preserve a remnant, usually the faithful ones. And we see how this plays out actually in the days of Jeremiah, so we'll get to that in a few weeks, how God preserves the faithful remnant from the judgment. They will survive and they will carry forward with God's promises so that David would still have a king on the throne, and so that Israel would still be the people of God and such. One of the other themes that comes across in the book of Isaiah a lot, though, is about the coming Messiah, and in one of the chapters it's referred to him as the servant of the Lord. And so this is the prophetic passages that refer to Jesus. One of these is in Isaiah 7 verse 14, where we have the promise of Emmanuel that Matthew quotes. I think Matthew also quotes from Isaiah 9 verses 6 through 7. And this is when Isaiah is prophesying that Pekah the son of Remaliah will not destroy the kingdom of Judah, even though they were threatening to in that time. Jesus is also referred to as the branch from Jesse in Isaiah chapter 11. And then the suffering servant imagery of Jesus comes across in Isaiah 52 and 53. And that actually describes the crucifixion in a lot of detail and nails it quite accurately. 700 years before it took place and before the Persians had even invented that means of executing a person. So it wasn't like he was just describing something he knew of. It had not even been invented yet. He also talks about salvation and redemption. And interestingly, Isaiah extends that redemption not just to the people of Israel, but also to the Gentiles. And that's something that's promised for all the rest of the nations, which was kind of puzzling for the Jews. How does this get extended to the Gentiles? But in the church age, we see that, yeah, the gospel isn't for just the Jews, it's for all of God's people everywhere in the world. So that includes us. And then there's also the image of the new heaven and the new earth that comes across, and we're going to look at, that won't be tonight though. Next week we'll look at the new heaven and the new earth. He also talks about hope and restoration, and he includes a very universal scope of God's kingdom. It's not just Judah, it's not just the Israelites, it is over all the nations of the world that God rules and reigns. Let's see. Talked about those. Talked about that. So let's get on to the prophet Micah. So Micah is a contemporary. He is a much shorter book than Isaiah makes. Only 7 chapters. He prophesies during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, so just a little bit shorter. Interestingly, he is referenced in the book of Jeremiah, a later prophet. the elders of Judah say we should not kill Jeremiah, even though he's prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem, because in the days of Micah of Moresheth, Micah prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, but all the people repented and turned back to God, and God relented on that judgment. So we should leave Jeremiah alone, and Micah was the case study for that. Come back to that in a couple weeks with Jeremiah. Micah has some similar themes, but some different nuances. He also talks about the injustices and corruption and prophesies judgment is coming because of it. He also uses the same imagery that Hosea uses in the idolatry of Judah being compared to adultery in a marriage relationship between a man and a woman. And so Micah portrays God as bringing a legal case against Israel as having forsaken him and turned away after other gods, much as a husband might bring a case against an unfaithful, adulterous wife. Talks about the coming judgment and destruction, not only of Jerusalem, but also of Samaria. And Samaria falls while he's prophesying, actually, during the reign of Hezekiah. But like Jeremiah or Isaiah, he also prophesies about a remnant, how there is hope, and there will be restoration coming. Part of that restoration is gathering all the scattered people, which is important because that was what the Assyrians were doing. Conquer a people and then scatter them to the four corners of the earth. He actually pegs Bethlehem as the birthplace of Jesus, Messiah.
Oh, is that what the wise men did?
And that's what the wise men used. Yep. They knew in Herod's day the Messiah, the king to come, was going to be born in Bethlehem. And so in the Gospel of Matthew, we see Micah 5 verse 2 referenced. They knew he was coming from Bethlehem, which was a small, sleepy little agricultural village in those days. He also prophesies about God's compassion and forgiveness, and also hints at how all the nations of the world will come to worship God in the mountain of the Lord. So he foretells of this age where Gentiles are seeking after God as well, not just the Jews and the people of Israel.
Did you know that there's a McDonald's in Bethlehem?
That does not surprise me. Not surprise me at all.
My dad had McDonald's in Bethlehem when he went there. It's quite funny.
All right. Next week, we will continue into this next section. We'll teaching on mountaintop prophecy and a lens through which you can interpret some of the prophetic passages of the Old Testament. So, with that, we'll close for tonight, and we'll pick this up next week.